Yes, well, the revised Brussels IIb regulation, we have heard a lot already from my colleagues and from, in particular, in lots of details from Mirela already. What I'm about to talk is changes and challenges for the cooperation between central authorities and judges. And since I'm from a central authority, it will be a very subjective practitioner's view. I will jump right ahead to the next one, please. Yes, and Mirela and Mr. Romano already cited the regulation, and I picked to give you some basic understanding what's new in the Brussels IIb. I took a look in the recitals, and there you can see it summarized quite well, I think, what Mirela and Mr. Romano already mentioned. It's all about cooperation, actually. As you can see, what the new regulation was about to do is facilitate the cooperation of judicial and administrative authorities, and access to judges should be simplified, and exchanges of information between the authorities should be improved. Actually, that's the large and big aim of the regulation. It was all about cooperation in the beginning, and it is more so by now. What is outlined and further enhanced is you should use all means available. That underlines the importance of cooperation and communication, and you should use all instruments of international judicial cooperation. In the end, giving my personal opinion, I sometimes doubted whether that was really achieved in the regulation in the way they do it, but well, I come to that later. Well, the next sheet, please. Yes, as was already mentioned, we have one big change from the current state is that we have the central authorities more involved and in cooperation. Actually, we have a more or less obligatory way of communication via the central authorities, as given here in recital 75. And what was already mentioned before is speeding up of proceedings, not only concerning the operation and practice of the central authorities, but in particular also of courts and competent authorities. I picked one example in recital 85. That's the 3 months time limit, particularly applying to the central authority. Next sheet, please. Yeah, just to sum up, we heard a lot about the specific provisions already. That's just a bit of a list here, and don't take me for granted. I mean, it's probably incomplete. It just gives you some examples. As mentioned, we have multiple new cooperation obligations. This is supposed to sum up obligations that are not there, at least not explicitly there in the current regulation, but are now implemented in the new one. We, for example, have for the courts and competent authorities the obligation to inform about urgent measures being taken. We have in child abduction proceedings a number of new provisions, in particular time limits. The famous 6 + 6 + 6, as outlined here in Article 24 and Article 28, meaning that return proceedings should last 6 weeks in first instance, 6 weeks in second instance, and shall not take longer than 6 weeks during enforcement. We have a whole new scope of, let's say, content or subject matter which courts have to deal with in return proceedings, regulated now, harmonized in Europe, or regulated now in the regulation. It specifically concerns access, which has to be considered during return proceedings. And of course, we have the totally new, and for me, that's a very substantial broadening of the subject matter in return proceedings. We have the new opportunity or even obligation to install protective measures upon return in case of Article 13 of the 1980 Hague Convention. That wasn't there before because it was a matter and a problem of jurisdiction. Return proceedings were supposed to deal only with return and shall order the return, nothing more. And now it sort of continues beyond that. As mentioned already, in particular by Mirela, we have Article 80. That's a whole new provision on central authorities, basically. But also we have some obligations for courts and competent authorities, information about relocation, and we have this whole Article 81, this implementation provision, which is something in between recognition and enforcement, sort of a adoption and modification of decisions. And of course, we have for the courts and the competent authorities, mainly the courts, we have a whole bunch of new certificates. I think it's 9 altogether by now, but I might be mistaken, I might have forgotten one. Yes, the next sheet, please. Hopping over to the central authorities. As already briefly outlined, we have there a multiple number of new provisions. It's a 5-day reply in Hague Convention proceedings. We have to reply within acknowledged receipt of an application within 5 days. Basically, we will have to outline the 6-week deadline for enforcement to competent courts, if so requested by another state or the applicant. It's basically an extension of Article 11 in the 1980 Hague Convention. We have, as mentioned already, the explicit obligation to localize the child, and we do have the possibility to do so, to rephrase it. We have new social reports, obligations, and opportunities to collect some. As mentioned already, we have that obligatory information on relocation. We have that, for me, that's a major difference to the existing regulation. We have this offer of placement, which for me is a sort of intervention in domestic proceedings, which wasn't there in the previous and existing regulation, but is now given. You can actually offer for or make an offer to have a child placed in one own country. 56 in the existing regulation only includes the other way round. It's the placing authority asking for permission to place a child. Yes, and then of course the major change, we have that sort of obligatory involvement of central authorities, and of course number of time limits, as mentioned already, 3 months time limit in particular when it comes to social reports or within placement provisions, and many other time limits as well. So next sheet, please. Yes, for courts and competent, as you can see, we have new obligations for cooperation, communication, coordination, explicit ones and completely new ones. We have a number of time limits, 6 + 6 + 6. We have a number of new certificates. We have a whole new system of at least partially harmonized enforcement proceedings when it comes to foreign decisions to be recognized and enforced in one country. That's a completely new system. We have a extension of the previously, for me, limited nature of introductory proceedings only concerning the return as such. Now we have a number of new issues to be included in the proceedings, access and adequate protection measures. And as mentioned, we have this sort of intervention in what I would call purely domestic proceedings. But when you take a look at, in particular, that offer of placement provision, there aspects of nationality and citizenship come in. They are very prominent. They have been adopted from Article 15 and have been transformed and implemented here. In that aspect, this is something new, because for me, nationality and citizenship was not really included in the previous regulation, except for that very narrow exception in Article 15, and that is significantly broadened here from my understanding. The next sheet, please. And the same thing, of course, summarized for the central authorities. Again, we have completely new obligations, for example, localization and social reports. We have time limits for us as well. We have more involvement in domestic proceedings. We will have to get in touch with our national courts and competent authorities in proceedings which were to some extent out of the scope of the regulation up until now. We have that obligatory communication check via central authorities. We have that fundamental change in child abduction proceedings. And of course, the whole regulation is, I think, 5 times the length and articles of the previous regulation. So it's going to be way more complicated, I think. And that's what I would like to summarize in essence. We have a lot more cooperation and communication. We have more harmonization. We have very detailed regulations included now. But from my perspective, that makes it also more complex and complicated. And of course, you may discover in the practice, of course, some lacks, because it's regulated in so much detail that if you, and of course, in practice, you always stumble upon a case which doesn't fit in the regulations. And then you will have to ask, and it's, for me, it's getting more difficult as a practitioner to find a loophole or a way in between, because it's so detailed. And of course, it's more cooperation required in total. For me, as a central authority, give my personal opinion, sometimes it's less for us, more for competent authorities or courts. But in general, we are more prominent in the whole regulation. It might be, as mentioned earlier on, it certainly has positive aspects, since we are the experts. Actually, we can help a lot. But of course, as being criticized before, and which was basically the starting point of the whole regulation, it going via us takes time, and it may even prolong in proceedings and communication and cooperation by having to go via us. That's why what I sometimes doubt what the whole intention was, is because direct communication, if it works, that's well for me. That's okay for me as a central authority. I don't need to get involved in cases which run smoothly. So I don't speeding up proceedings, harmonizing things, making it easier and simpler. That was the general aim. And I do have my doubts whether having a complicated system, a very detailed system, a obligatory communication way, whether that will going to really help to achieve the aims as set out. That's my very personal opinion, but many things are very good. I ask, for example, specifically as a member of the working group, I really favored some of the time limits. So we will see how it will work out in practice. It's going to be, and I look forward to the discussion, what especially my colleagues are going to say on that. Thanks.